Good morning. Today's lectures are about FrameNet, and I hope to get into some of the nitty-gritty details about the project. Before we do that, I want to let you know that the slides from yesterday's lectures are available on the course website, and remind you that tomorrow's reading is the Fillmore et al. 2003b. It's the article about attaching. So it's about the FrameNet process, some of which we'll talk about today. So in terms of content, we're going to look in some detail at the project overall, and the process that FrameNet lexicographers go through to create frames, lexical units, edit frames and lexical units, and we'll get a beginning view of how annotation is done. Oops, sorry. Before we do that, however, I want to spend a little bit of time on the assignment that I gave you yesterday, which was to come up with an example sentence in Portuguese of the script that you talked about in your group at the end of the morning session. And I would like to begin with some volunteers who are going to stand up so everybody can hear them and tell us the sentence that you came up with and what script it instantiates, and then we'll go from there. Volunteers? So this is the way it's going to work. If you don't volunteer, I'm going to ask you. Do you want to stand up?
Bom dia, gente. Então,
the scene we thought about was the hotel scene, hospitality. I thought of a sentence. The guest has paid the receptionist the money that he booked 2 weeks ago. So I thought about the core elements. We have a problem. It's cutting out. So the payment method, the location, the hotel, and the reservation things, and the time he paid for.
Okay, so can you tell me the names, not the personal names, but how you would identify the participants in that scenario?
So we've thought about the participants as being the traveler, the guest, the receptionist, or a worker, the payment method, how the service will be paid, and how long the service, the matter of hospitality.
So if I understood it all, we have a traveler or the hotel guest, the receptionist, or can you hear me? through the microphone? Yeah, okay. So the traveler or the guest, I think in this case we'd want to use something as specific as the guest, right? Because you can be a traveler but not necessarily stay in a hotel. Then the person who works in the hotel, and you said the method of payment and the duration of the stay in the hotel.
Eu posso dizer
Can I possibly say, can I call the receptionist as, or I can identify him as a worker of the hotel? Is there any specific word I should use?
I think the question is there a role that's unique to that situation, and would there be a very efficient way of naming that role? When I say efficient, what I really mean is, can you think of a name for the role that would be a hint to someone annotating your example sentence that that's the role you mean, right? So worker is more general than hotel receptionist, right? Worker would not be wrong. I mean, there's no such thing as an incorrect name for a role or frame element. The question is really, can you think of a name that would be representative of what the role actually is? Okay, thank you. Do we have another volunteer? Somebody from this side of the room.
Good morning, you all. My contribution here will be about a problem sentence. The explanation, you feel free to discuss. Our scene, it was the classroom scene, and a sentence that I've selected was the way that the teacher is presented in the classroom helped in the problem that the students presented in the classroom.
Okay, so if I understood correctly, your general situation was the classroom, and your sentence illustrated how the teacher helps a student solve a problem. Is that correct? Yeah? Okay. So now, can you tell us the names of the participants, or can you list the participants in that scene?
The teacher. There is the teacher, the students, in a problem situation, problematic situation.
Okay. So the roles that you identified, the participants in the situation?
The teacher helps the students. The students have. They come up to. They see the teacher as somebody who can help them in any situation.
Okay, so You have a teacher and a student, or teachers and students, and you have a problematic situation that needs resolution. Is that right? Yeah, okay, good. So you're beginning to get a sense of how on FrameNet we think about defining unique situations, naming the participants and the other roles in that situation. And your example sentence was meant to help you in that process. You think of a sentence, what situation in what situation would you use that sentence? And how do the participants interact? Okay? So now we're going to go on to look at the FrameNet process. Sorry, the FrameNet project. We're starting with the FrameNet project. And as you know, FrameNet is housed at the International Computer Science Institute. Chuck Fillmore is the principal investigator. He's been the head of the project, obviously, since its beginning in 1997. Colin Baker is the project manager. FrameNet has had funding from the National Science Foundation, as well as DARPA, which is the research arm of the Defense Department. The Defense Department in the US actually funds a lot of basic research, not only research related to military matters. And I wanted to make a point of mentioning that because even in the US, people don't realize that basic research gets a lot of funding from the Defense Department. FrameNet has received other support by way of visitors to the project, in particular, the German Academic Exchange has a postdoc that allows researchers to come for a year or two, and their work both draws on and contributes to FrameNet. Another very important source of support has been, in the past, the German Salsa project, headed by Manfred Pinkel. They had opportunities for exchange. So many of the researchers on the Salsa project came to Berkeley and worked with us to help them develop their project. And of course, their work in turn contributed to ours. When a research project, a FrameNet-like research project for another language begins, there are always issues that need to be resolved, and oftentimes the issues that need to be resolved force us to think about, wait a minute, have we done what we set out to do? Have we characterized our data in the best way possible, given our criteria for annotation, given our criteria for defining frames? So it's always very useful to hear the perspective of people working on another language, because other languages do things differently. And I'm sure I'll have that opportunity while I'm here to speak with the people working on FrameNet Brazil. I apologize for forgetting to advance. Yes. Thank you. So, when asked what is FrameNet, obviously my answer depends upon my audience. One of the things I say to people who are somewhat familiar with frame semantics is that FrameNet is the most sophisticated instantiation of the theory of frame semantics. Of course, frame semantics existed long before FrameNet was even an idea. Even though, as I pointed out yesterday, all of the ideas that are instantiated in FrameNet exist in Fillmore's earliest works. And it wasn't until the inception of FrameNet that we had the opportunity to actually see those ideas applied in a very full-fleshed way in FrameNet. So FrameNet is, as you know, a computational lexicography project based on the principles of frame semantics. And we talked about some of those principles yesterday. And I'm going to be going over that again today, providing some additional information. The project is building a lexical resource for contemporary English that provides a body of semantically and syntactically annotated sentences from which reliable information can be reported on the valences or combinatorial possibilities of each item analyzed. We talked a bit about valences yesterday, and we're going to go into some further detail about valences today. FrameNet is also using corpus evidence to document its findings. So prior to FrameNet, lexicographers looked at corpora, and linguists tended almost exclusively, certainly in contemporary American linguistics, linguists tended to engage in what we call armchair linguistics. That is, they sat in their chairs and they rested their arms, relaxed, and thought. They thought about how they themselves use their language. Sometimes they asked their students and their friends whether certain sentences were possible. And then they built theories from those judgments. Once Chuck Fillmore met Sue Atkins, a prominent lexicographer from the UK, who for many years worked at Oxford University Press, if I am not mistaken, Sue prevailed upon Chuck both to create FrameNet and to use corpora for evidence. Of course, that became possible once we had the technology for the creation and manipulation of corpora. So FrameNet bases its evidence on corpora, not just on what the lexicographers, what the linguists working on the project think or imagine. As we said yesterday, frame semantics is an approach to the understanding and description of the meanings of lexical items and grammatical constructions, which assumes that to understand the meanings of the words in a language, as well as the constructions in a language, we must first have knowledge of the semantic frames. During the period of time that I'm lecturing, our focus is going to be primarily on lexical material. When Michael begins lecturing next week, his lectures will include more work about constructions and construction grammar, but it's important to know that, first of all, when Fillmore was developing these theories, he was developing them in tandem. That is, frame semantics and construction grammar were standing side by side and moving ahead in their development. And today we always talk about, depending if you work in frame semantics or construction grammar, you either say that construction grammar is the sister theory of frame semantics, or if you primarily do work in construction grammar, you're likely to say construction, sorry, I said it the other way around. If you work in frame semantics, you say, yes, construction grammar is the sister theory of frame semantics, taking the perspective, as we noted yesterday, of frame semantics. If you primarily work in construction grammar, then you usually think about frame semantics as being the sister of construction grammar, taking the perspective of the construction grammarian. I primarily work in frame semantics, though I've dabbled in construction grammar. So from my perspective, construction grammar is the sister theory of frame semantics, but they really do work in tandem. Next. So as we said, a semantic frame is a schematic representation of a situation, object, event, or relation, providing the background structure against which words are understood. And I've highlighted understood and U for U-semantics and the semantics of understanding to emphasize that the notion of understanding is at the heart of the enterprise. The goal, as I said yesterday, is to figure out what a speaker of a language needs to know in order to use the language appropriately. So I'm going to give you some examples of the over 800 semantic frames that FrameNet now has defined. And then I'm going to give you the frame definitions of one or two of these frames, and we're going to look at an example sentence. The purpose of doing this is so that you get a sense of the range of types of frames that are in FrameNet, and at least an initial sense for what is annotated. Okay, so some frames that exist in FrameNet that can be characterized as a situation are being attached or being necessary. An event frame is, for example, communication or hiring or replacing. Some of the frames that cover names for objects or entities are buildings, containers, intoxicants. I have a very specific reason for mentioning the object frames as well as the relation frames, and I'll get to that when I give you examples. And the last kind that I'm going to mention this morning is frames that characterize relations. And the frame we'll look at is called locative relation. FrameNet defines the being awake frame, which is a frame that characterizes a situation, in the following way. A protagonist is awake at some time and place. This entails that the protagonist has a higher general level of awareness of the surroundings than when asleep. And our example is Victor was not awake during the lecture on campus, where Victor instantiates the protagonist. During the lecture is the time, and on campus is the place. And this has nothing to do with Vitor sitting in the class here. It just is a name that came to mind. The hiring frame, which we would call an event frame, is one in which an employer hires an employee, promising the employee a certain compensation in exchange for performing a job described either in terms of a task or a position. And our examples, Tiago hired Miriam to teach the course, where to teach the course is the task, and Tiago hired Miriam as lecturer is the position. So it's the name of the position. Notice, of course, here that to teach the course and as lecturer, both include the head of the phrase, right? So not just the noun phrase part of those phrases, but in the first case, the preposition to as well. This is relevant because when we start looking in more detail about tabulating results of FrameNet annotation, and we have a set of valences, we're going to see that the type of, for example, preposition that heads a phrase makes a difference in terms of the valence description of a particular lexical item. Next. So now we're looking at the containers frame. We describe containers, which is an object frame, as covering entities prototypically conceived of and created to fulfill the function of containing. That is, containers that contain objects or substances, the contents. And the example sentence we have is, Anna grabbed the wine glasses. Notice here that the word under consideration, glasses, is a noun. Until now, I've mostly only showed you examples where the word under consideration, or what we call the target, was a predicate. I bring this example not only because I wanted to illustrate frames that cover mostly objects and entities, but also as a reminder that while initially we looked only at predicates, that is we here, which to some extent mirrors what happened in the initial phase of FrameNet. The argument structure of verbs, the dependence of verbs in a sentence, conceptually is easy to understand. So it's a good place to start in talking about the project and the process. But it's important to know that nouns also evoke frames, and they have dependence, right? So they too have frame structure. Okay? Here in our example, as I said, glasses, the target, is the container, right? And that's more or less the case with most noun frames, with most noun targets. That is, the noun target is both the target and carries the frame element that it names. Again, very different from verbs. and the word wine instantiates the contents. Wine being the dependent of glasses, right? Next. Locative relation. This is very interesting frame, also because the target, the lexical units that are housed in this frame are prepositions, right? Again, prepositions, initially we don't think about prepositions as having frame structure, but of course they do. It's just that it might be a little more difficult conceptually to get a handle on it, to understand how that works. With verbs, it's pretty transparent. Even someone with only basic linguistic training has a sense that the verb is the center of the sentence and things happen around the verb. Nevertheless, prepositions also have frame structure. So we define the locative relation frame as one in which a figure is located relative to a ground location. The location of the figure may be further specified by its distance from a reference location and the direction in which the figure lies from a reference location. Reference location is usually the deictic center. Our simple example sentence, just to illustrate this frame, is the cat is on the mat. The word under consideration is the preposition on. The figure is the cat, and the ground is the mat. Does everyone see how that works? Okay. So, is there a question? Now that we've seen some FrameNet frames with some typical examples, let's go back and consider the definition of a frame that we had yesterday, only now look at it more specifically in terms of FrameNet. So a FrameNet frame is a schematic representation of a situation involving various participants, props, and other conceptual roles, each of which is a frame element. Now, I highlighted conceptual roles because yesterday we didn't spend much time thinking about notions such as time and place, right? We talked about participants and props, right? You had a waiter, the waiter brought the menu, so the waiter is a participant, the menu would be a prop. But there are other things going on during, for example, an event. Events happen at a certain time in a particular place, whether or not we see any linguistic realization of those concepts. So it's important to know that frame elements will identify other conceptual roles, not just participants and props. Now this is interesting, I think, in part because in the earliest work, time and place were not really fleshed out. So if you think back to the case-for-case, we're not looking at concepts such as time and place. Moving forward, as we get into the actual day-to-day work of FrameNet, looking at real data from a corpus, it comes right out. You have to notice it. You have to be able to say something about it, and you're going to characterize it. Okay, so a FrameNet frame provides the background and motivation for the existence and use of a lexical item broadly defined in a language. Now, why do I say broadly defined? Certainly in English, we use the word essentially to identify that which occurs between two blank spaces. But phrasal material, in a very important way, is not that different from, strictly speaking, that which occurs between two blank spaces. Consider what we call multi-word expressions. Say a prayer, take a nap. Do either of those really convey anything that different from pray or nap? So the issue to think about is why do we limit, or why would there be a need to limit our investigation to only that which occurs between two blank spaces? Other examples of phrasal material are fixed phrases. So the expression, the big cheese, which I imagine nobody in this audience knows what that means. But the point about fixed phrases is that they're fixed. You cannot swap out any element and have it mean the same thing. So the expression, the big cheese, means the boss, the most important person in the company, for example. I could not say the big fruit and have it mean the same thing. I couldn't say, well, I could say the little cheese, and people who know what the big cheese means would also be able to figure out that I mean the person in the organization with the lowest status. But swapping out big for little doesn't give me the same meaning. So the point about fixed phrases is you can't swap out any element and retain the same meaning. And knowing the meaning of the individual parts does not help you with the meaning of the whole. So in a very important way, big cheese is comparable to boss. It just happens to have more than one word in it. And then, of course, there are idioms, such as a white lie. In English, a white lie is not as bad a lie as a lie. Usually someone will tell a white lie if they don't want to offend the person with whom they're speaking. So they kind of stretch the truth a little bit. Or maybe they don't want to get themselves in trouble, so they gloss over some of the details. And it's not really so terrible, right? Well, much like fixed phrases, you don't know the meaning of a white lie. You don't know the meaning of the idiom, a white lie, just by knowing the meanings of the individual parts. So the point here is that not only in FrameNet, which, although we've only done a limited amount of work on multi-word expressions, but more generally, in thinking about the lexicon, we don't think about the lexicon as only made up of, so to speak, words, only made up of linguistic material that occurs between two blank spaces. Like everything else in language, there's a continuum, right? There are some items that are just words, but there are other items that probably belong in what we would call the lexicon, as opposed to the grammar, that are made up of more than one word. Tiago, how are we doing on time? Oh, Tiago's not here. Okay, let's go on. Yes. Okay.
Two things to point out. The first one is the example you gave, kick the bucket.
Yes?
In English and Portuguese, they have very different meanings.
Yeah?
For example, kick the bucket in English means die, right?
It also means die, because kick the bucket in English, of course, has a literal sense. But as an idiom, it only means die. So I could be looking at someone who has many objects in front of him and say to him, kick the bucket. And I'm not saying die. You can't order someone to die. I'm saying kick the bucket.
But I mean, in Portuguese, you also have two meanings. You can have kick the bucket as I'm fed up and I'm going to get done with this. Or kick an object that is the bucket.
Right. So, okay. So what you're saying is that something analogous to kick the bucket exists in Portuguese as an idiom, but it has a completely different meaning from that of English. Yeah.
And
that's what makes linguistics so much fun.
Yeah.
Yeah?
The second thing I'd like to ask is, you talked about nouns.
Yeah.
Prepositions.
Yes.
And verb.
Yes.
And my question is, what about the adjectives?
Yes.
That would be the fourth category Chomsky talked about.
Well, first of all, FrameNet deals with all parts of speech. We've had more opportunity to work on verbs, nouns, and as you said, adjectives. To some extent, we've worked on adverbs and prepositions. So we don't limit the investigation, we don't limit the research or the analysis to any single part of speech. I can only say from the perspective of the history of the development of the FrameNet database, we've done more work on verbs and nouns than we have on adjectives, adverbs, prepositions, and multi-word expressions. Mostly, I would say, because of the nature of our tools. In particular, it's easier to search a corpus for a verb and look at the results than it is to search a corpus to look for multi-word expressions. And as I started hinting, conceptually, as an intellectual process, I think it was easier for all of us to get a handle on verbs than on nouns. But there's no a priori reason other than those kind of logistic reasons to do one or the other. So maybe now would be a good time to take a break.